Okay, let's kick off. Welcome to the last talk of the Martin Center Research Seminar Series of the Easter Term 2021. This seminar is hosted and supported by the Martin Center for Architectural and Urban Studies at the University of Cambridge. The theme for the seminar this year is Energy, Architecture and Energy. I'm Louise, one of the conveners of this year's seminar series. Today, it is our great honor to have Dr. Alison Brooks and Dr. Bob Allies. And also, I'd like to offer a warm welcome to our audiences. We can see there is a fixed, relatively fixed group of audiences from our department, and I also see some new names, new faces from maybe other institutes, and it is a great honor to have such a large group of audiences from all over the world. And today's talk is going to be around like 40 minutes, and today's seminar is going to be recorded until we open the channel for Q&A section, and we will upload the recording after upload to our YouTube channel after the talk. And the talk is live streaming on Facebook. And after the talk, our audiences can join our Q&A section. There are several ways to join. You can really encourage our audiences to raise their virtual hand by clicking the raise hand button under your screen. And in doing this, we'll invite you to the panelists, and you can turn on your camera and unmute yourself and discuss the interesting topic, which we're face-to-face with Alison and Bob. And alternatively, if you are not comfortable with talking face-to-face, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and hopefully Bob will read it out, and Alison and Bob will discuss these questions together with you. And now I would like to hand over the mic to our chair today, Bob.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Louise. I'm very pleased to have been invited to chair today's proceedings, partly because I'm an enormous admirer of Alison Brooks' architecture, but also I'm particularly interested in the way she's framed the talk that she's going to give today under its title, 19th Century London, a 21st Century Model for Embedded Productivity, Mixity and Hyper-Locality. Alison Brooks trained at the University of Waterloo and came in Canada and came to London in 1988, which I think is when she and I first met, because we interviewed her for a job at Allies & Morrison. In fact, we offered her a job at Allies & Morrison, but she turned us down, to my enormous regret. But we've remained friends, and of course, often we're also competitors. And so I've been able to follow her extraordinary career over that subsequent period. And happily now on 2 occasions, she's designed buildings within 2 of our master plans. And one of those, the one at King's Cross, she's going to talk about as part of her talk today. In the end, Alison set up her own practice in 1996 and is now recognized as one of the most important architects of her generation in Britain, working across a range of sectors from housing to the arts. But I think it's fair to acknowledge the particular contribution she's made to thinking about the domestic, to the domestic domain, to the home. For me, I suppose what is particularly fascinating about her work is its combination of architectural ambition and urban responsibility. It's always inventive and always surprising, but it's also sensitive and accommodating. I mean, put simply, I suppose, her buildings manage to both stand out and fit in. Her work has been garnered with many awards, not least the Stirling Prize for her work at Accordia in Cambridge. But also outside the practice, she's always maintained an involvement in architectural education, with visiting posts currently in Harvard and also in Madrid, where she's the visiting professor in a master's course on collective housing. I think at that point, I might welcome Alison to the stage, to the virtual stage, and hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for your very generous words. And I remember very well, just like yesterday, going in for my interview with you and Graham. I think you were in office maybe of, I don't know, 10 or 20 people back then. But yes, serendipity, chance, all of these things came into play. But it has been very nice to work within your master plans and within the work of Allies in Morrison, which I very much admire and which you have taken beyond UK borders around the world. So it's wonderful to be able to work within one of your projects, which are incredibly thoughtful and for me represent sort of the best of British urban design kind of renewed. So it's a great honor to have you introduce me. Thank you. I guess I should share my screen and go to full screen. Okay, see if this works. Okay, I will try to make this full screen. So as Bob said, I've named this lecture 19th Century London, a 21st century model, which is kind of a paradox, but it represents what I think is one of the most important things in architecture, which is to value and understand history and our collective history, cultural history, urban history, and that it's a model for embedded productivity, mixity, and hyperlocality. And I think this kind of reconsideration of the city as being a place where we need to produce, where we need to have more mixed use, where we value and use our local places much more, is of course a product of the COVID-19 pandemic over the past year, which still isn't finished. But I think even before that, we were all thinking a lot harder about how to reduce our energy use in light of the climate crisis, how to support kind of local culture, local economies, all in light of reducing our carbon footprint and combating climate change. So I'm going to start this talk. Let me see if I can change slides here, would help. Hang on a second. Okay, so I'm starting with this map of London, and I'm going to talk about maps a lot in this talk, but because I love the map of London, if you can love maps, for me, the organic quality of the map, it represents its history from Roman times to ley lines and field boundaries and paths of trade and exchange, topography, but it's got this wonderful sort of messiness interspersed with Baroque and city beauty. I had the great fortune to work here, and oops, sorry. I have books of maps of North America, and they're wonderfully illustrated with pictures and scenes of what was happening at the time in the 1870s. And I was very surprised to see in this illustration in the bottom middle, the mansion house, timber frame, sort of colonnaded, verandahed mansion house in a very small town in Grimsby, Ontario. And there's very much a sort of importation of Georgian architecture and ideals into the New World, into Canada in the 19th century. And you see this, of course, mirrored in the UK. And one of the reasons I moved to London or decided to stay settled was the fact that the city itself is, of course, as we know, a kind of very green and amenable place. And of course, there's the sort of incredible typologies, this what I call archetypal urban form, the terrace as a housing format, which has become a sort of archetype and a typology that's adapted over time to house many uses, from the Architectural Association in Bedford Square, all the hotels, offices, hospitals. The generosity and robustness of this typology has allowed it to, in a way, become a sort of civic building that's universal in its use. Another building and a kind of archetype that I love and refer to a lot is Somerset House, which is a quadrangle, a little bit modeled on Place des Vosges in Paris, but interestingly, William Chambers designed it as a series of terraced houses for officers. And so this kind of amazing quadrangle started out as terraced houses, but is also the first mixed use building really ever built in purpose-built mixed use. And you can see on the right the list of all the different functions that this quad accommodated, from government offices to the Barge Master's Office to the Royal Society of Antiquaries. And as we know, the Somerset House has evolved and become the Courtauld Institute, King's College, art galleries, festivals, biennales, ice skating, and concerts. And it's kind of an incredible institution, cultural institution. And I was fortunate enough to celebrate the 21-year anniversary of my practice there a few years ago with an exhibition and lecture and events. And I published this book, which in a way summarized the ideals that have underpinned my practice in the 21 years before, and which spurred the ideas, the architectural ideas. So in a way, the kind of urban ideals as well inform the architectural ideas. But authenticity, generosity, civicness, and beauty are the four ideals, which I kind of framed the work of my practice in sort of retrospectively in this book. And so while I was, since I've been living in London, over time, I realized that the housing typologies, of course, are not limited to terraced houses and variations on those, but the mansion block became more a part of my consciousness as a super interesting, sort of family-friendly, medium density housing typology. And this is Elgin Avenue. Maida Vale is famous for its streets of mansion blocks. But then if you pay attention as you go around London, you can see that the mansion block was a kind of source of incredible architectural creativity in the 19th century. The styles range from sort of Edwardian Baroque with terracotta and cast iron embellishments on the left, Mount Street, J.T. Smith in Mayfair, or Chelsea, a more vertical style, starting to move into the kind of Tudor of the late Victorian period, or on the right, sort of Scottish baronial castle. There were so many styles and periods that were kind of represented in the mansion block, and probably the most dense and the most exuberant of them all is Albert Court near Royal Albert Hall, and it's one of the tallest as well. It's 9 stories, and it's an incredible compilation of styles, temple fronts, edicules, gables, turrets, you name it. So it kind of, in a way, this housing typology has become, for me, it represents the sort of exuberance of the 19th century architecturally, and in a way, the freedom that architects had to work with materials, with craftsmen. And in a way, this language has been really dismissed. Obviously, in the modernist period, it was seen as decadent and excessive. But I feel there are so many lessons to be learned, and a lot of joy that is experienced when you walk around these buildings and experiencing them as part of the public realm. So again, to sort of go back to 1988, when I first met Bob, I used to work in Chalk Farm when I was working for Ron Arad, and we had a project in Notting Hill, a little interior project. And I used to take I think it was the number 24 bus from Chalk Farm, sort of up through Belsize Park, and then across Maida Vale, and then through this funny neighborhood that I didn't know what it was, and then down into Notting Hill. And I would get out here and do my site visits and then take the bus back to Chalk Farm. I lived in Camden Town. And this experience of taking the bus and driving through this kind of no man's land really shocked me in a way. And it made me realize there was a kind of schism between really the Victorian city and the modernist utopia of the post-war period, or modernist utopias, and the kind of failed housing projects that I was also aware of from North America. The urban renewal projects in the States are a very similar condition or phenomenon. So this is what I would see as I drove, went past in the bus. And for me, it represented such an extreme form of kind of social segregation, as well as kind of architectural exception, the complete denial of the street, the not a single door or entrance at street level, all access is via a podium, cars dominate the ground plane. And you have these strange, you know, no man's land at podium level that gives you access to your home. And for me, I felt this was just wrong. People shouldn't have to live like this. And one day I was going to do something about it. If I had the chance, I sort of thought I wanted to start my practice in a way to, of course, work in public buildings and cultural projects, but also to address housing, the most fundamental and most important form of architecture, I think, there is, because it has an impact on people's everyday life and their sense of well-being in a much more fundamental way than any other building type. So it was a real coincidence and kind of amazing when in 2010, I was invited by Lifshitz Davidson Sandilands to join them in a bid for one of the plots in the South Kilburn Estates regeneration. And so here you can see the outline of the South Kilburn Estate, and in turquoise, the sort of site, there's a larger site that we both worked on, but the turquoise one is the one I worked on. And we won a competition to design this phase. And you can see in dark gray, basically a complete reconstruction of the entire neighborhood, not that dissimilar from what happened in the post-war era. And here is where I go back to my kind of source of fascination, which is the 1935, one of the 1935 OS maps of London, which was one of the first things I investigated with my team when we got this project. And what was just really amazing was the kind of perfect consistency and the perfect or nearly perfect hierarchy, urban grain, distribution of uses, parks, avenues, terraced houses. It looks like a sort of complete Victorian city. In 1959, there was some bomb damage in South Kilburn, but not very much. Mainly, it was an urban renewal project. So basically, the entire top half of that plan I showed you was bulldozed. Fortunately, this sort of bit in the middle, which is mostly white in this plan, was saved by a resident sort of uprising before they managed to bulldoze the entire place. But on the left, you can see the kind of this utopian ideal of bringing people out of their terraced houses, off the ground, into the air, into modern, clean, hygienic slab blocks. And this, as we know, was the sort of cultural project of the post-war era. It was a social project as well, but a deeply, deeply flawed urban project where urban form basically took on a role that it shouldn't have taken, which was to basically control and limit access of its inhabitants to the wider neighborhood, to the street, to the fabric of the city, in the name of sort of green space and fresh air. So you can see on the left, South Kilburn in 1962, and on the right, an example of one of the bison block projects that was built. And this is actually the project, the latest project that I've worked on as a regeneration site, South Kilburn. So this is the wider segment of the 1935 OS plan that I sourced, and to sort of frame the work I was doing in South Kilburn. And this has since become a source of kind of endless fascination for me, because if you look closely, you can see that in 1935, there was an incredible mix of uses happening. You can see here, so here we're over near Ladbroke Grove. So the railway, Great Western Railway going into Euston is here. But amazingly, you have sort of almshouses and playgrounds and community centers and housing next to car factories with testing tracks, printing works opposite a park. These are really lovely terraced houses, schools, printing works, sorting offices. The kind of mix is really amazing. And then as you move sort of east across the map, you can see biscuit works, furniture works, laundry, parks, mews, lots of churches, bathhouses, halls. I mean, it's just really the ice factory, tip of the iceberg, really, because only the main uses were named in these maps. And then this is moving farther north and east, and this is now South Kilburn. And you can see this really interesting geometry that the surveyors and developers produced when they were building out this area in the late 1800s. And over time, I've sort of realized that all of these roads had to do with axes. This Oxford Road was to access onto St. John's Church, and Granville Road has its access onto St. Augustine's Church, which is also on axis with Kilburn Park Road, and this kind of chevron from which streets splay with a garden square at its center. There's sort of real invention and kind of orchestration of urban experience going on here. And then when you move to the south and east towards Maidaville, you can see the typologies sort of growing in scale, and these are the mansion blocks. So you can see they're like a enlarged version of the terraced house, but they're stacked. They're more or less stacked terraced houses. And to compensate for that density, the developers made these communal gardens at the center of each block. And sometimes there are sports centers at the center of each block. Often in the other areas, there are factories and workshops in the center of each block. So this strip of London in 1935 contained an incredible mix that was really built between 1860 and 1900. So pre-electricity, pre-cars. And so this was about urban living within a locality. And just doing a very quick sort of outline of all the different uses that used to populate South Kilburn before it was rebuilt in brown are all what can be seen as in manufacturing, from dairy to all different kinds of production, 2 bathhouses, and then orange is schools, and blue is churches, and pink are the pubs, and yellow is commercial. So, and obviously the Paddington Recreation Center, Queen's Park. So there's an amazing kind of kaleidoscopic mix of uses. So back to the projects. So by this amazing coincidence, I was asked to jointly compete for this site. And I should also mention that I live very close to South Kilburn. I live, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but just over here. So this is in a way my neighborhood. And so this is the site, and you can start to see here on the left, the condition of the kind of urban renewal projects, and then the traditional Victorian street pattern holding out on the south side of the street, and then the kind of slab blocks built in the 1960s to the north. And during this project, I was kind of interested in the sort of chevron building to the north of my site, and doing research in Brent libraries, we found that this was the first high-rise in-situ concrete housing building in London. So it was written up in the Builder and was shown as being an exemplary piece of housing, and you can see their maisonettes. So they're sort of, you know, 2-story houses in the air with this exuberant winged roof and quite a lovely sculptural stair. So there's, you know, there was ambition in a lot of these projects, architectural ambition. It's the urban form that primarily failed the communities it was supposed to serve. And I described this kind of segregation here with this red line on one side of the street. It's the urban renewal project. Nobody ever goes in there, although it's green, it's a no-go zone. And to the south, the traditional street pattern and terraced housing typologies. And this was what the site was like. This was 2010. So again, lots of green on the left where there should be buildings and frontages. And then as you get near the site, you can see it's not part of the street fabric. It's not part of the neighborhood. All the buildings turn their front doors away from the street, and you would never go in there unless you lived there. So it's a kind of cul-de-sac of a kind of social exclusion. So my first instincts were to basically restore the street frontage with a terrace that addresses the street as once was in its original form, to open up that terrace to the 1960s block to Canterbury Terrace, to create a new garden square, a public garden square, to reinstate the 19th century mews that was in the middle of the block, to bring public movement and access deeper into the site. And then 3 typologies, which are all kind of variations on either the mansion block or the terraced house. And these each address a different part of the site in a specific way. And so here you can see our site here, the mews, and then this is Lifshitz Davidson's terraces here, restoring really the 19th century form of the city with the mews. The main difference is there aren't workshops in the mews, but there's still the Kilburn Park Tube Station, a pub, and various social services in these buildings in the center. So this is the basic format of the scheme, which is called Ely Court. And the mansion block format inspired the work here, basically those mansion blocks in Elgin Avenue, which are based on the principle of a central stair with 1 flat on either side of the stair and lift core. And so this terrace is a mansion block. This is a little flat iron completion block, and these are mews houses. And so each of these, we had a set height limit within the master plan. It could only be 4 stories. And because the site is so thin, they're very thin blocks, only 12 meters deep. And you can see the mix of typologies. So 2 beds, 3 beds, 1 bed, and 2-story maisonettes in blue. And this is again, the same typology on an upper story, so a central stair and a flat on either side. And these are really lovely because they're dual aspect, only 2 flats per floor, which is amazing. And this kind of reflects the name mansion block, because it's like you're living in a house, a shared house, and you share a stair and there are no corridors. And this is a principle that I try to carry across all my projects, to not have corridors, basically, to just open up off of a stairwell. So here's the finished, the completed project, and you can see how the frontages more or less become a kind of street architecture. They're not, it's still the historic architecture in the distance, which is calling a lot of attention to itself, but in a very nice way. And our project, which has the communal entrances between 2-story maisonettes, and then the communal entrance leads you to flats above. And there are certain rules that I follow in all my housing projects that this facade describes, which is the principle of verandas, covered verandas and porticos as a threshold space to the home, recessed balconies that provide shelter and privacy, and French doors. So every room has a full height window, all ceilings are 2.6 meters high, and it just lends a kind of generosity, kind of spaciousness to the home when you have French doors and recessed balconies. So this is that sort of liminal space, this threshold space of pavement, garden, veranda, and portico. And this is how the recessed balconies actually create these wonderful places that are very accessible and sheltered and private and much more usable than bolt-on balconies. And so the language shifts as you move around the end of the mansion block, and here it's framing the new garden square. And then here is Canterbury Court on the right, a 1960s landmark project, and our Flatiron building in the distance. And building is a 100% social rent, and with all the flats adapted for disabled residents. And then these are Muse houses along the back, which are family houses, which are 2 and 3 stories high, 2 and 3 bedrooms. So this kind of demonstrates, actually, I should say, an enlightened client who is Brent Cancel, who's basically orchestrating and commissioning all of these projects. They tender them to the market after they've got planning, but the competition and commissioning stages, it's basically Brent Cancel trying to repair the mistakes of the past that they made in the post-war era. So in turquoise here is the second project, another competition that we won with Lifshitz Davidson Sandilands for another site, this time with much bigger brutalist towers set on a parking podium. These buildings could not be refurbished. The floor to ceiling heights were very low, and they suffered concrete rot, and they were thermally and acoustically nearly unlivable, with problems right up to the very top floors. So this project was for 220 units altogether, so 2 buildings by ABA, and these 2 buildings at the back by Lifshitz Davidson Sandilands. And we designed the master plan together with the ambition to restore and recreate a more pure mansion block. So, and one of the things about the mansion block is that they don't turn corners. Usually, they're usually bar buildings, and what that means is that you can repeat each module so that it's more kind of systematic in terms of its organization, and you get gaps at all the corners which let sunlight into the communal gardens. So we designed a big mansion block on Kilburn Park Road, set back from the street, and a point block here that lets light in because this is the south. And this is the sort of repeating sort of figure of the plan with a 1 bed and 2 beds on either side of a core, so only 3 flats per floor, again with no corridor. And the beauty of the mansion block is that you can configure it it also in section in different ways. So Ely Court had 2-story duplexes on the ground floor. This project has 2-story duplexes under the roof. So they're sort of big units up top, benefiting from lots of sun and great views. And then 1-beds and 2-beds distributed along. And then in pink, these 2 parts of the building were social rent. So it's basically 60% market sale and 40% social rent. And so again, this building is very much about framing the street and responding to the kind of axis which focuses on St. Augustine's Church. And I was trying to kind of set up a rhythm that responded to the verticality of the spire and the angle of the roof, which sort of echoes the angle of the spire in the distance. So this becomes as much a framing device for the street as it is anything else. And I guess you can see, again, the language of French doors, of recessed or Juliet balconies, always made private with surrounds so that they are also shaded. And this, on the right, you can see the kind of view across to Paddington Recreation Centre from these top floor duplexes, which have kitchens that open onto these sort of double height balconies. And then at the top of the site, we've made a new pedestrian passage and a square next to the bus station. And this is a public route to allow everybody deeper into the estate, sort of cut through the project and enjoy the communal gardens on their way to the bus stop. So the language changes facing west to all the flats are through flats, and so they have balconies on the street and on the garden, so you can use the flat as you would a house. And this is the kind of south end, the prow with the leaf-shaped building that lets sun into the communal gardens. And this is also a 100% social rent building, little point block, and with really wonderful dual aspect units and recessed balconies that play a kind of game between interiority and exteriority and frame these great views. And finally, the third project is Durham and Gloucester Court was the name of the original scheme. It was another competition that this time I did with Field and Clegg Bradley and Court Scott. Sorry. And this was back to the future, back to 1988, the very site that I used to drive by in the bus and kind of you know, just really question both the motives and the thinking of what went on when they, for example, blocked the street that was on access to the church to make these parking podiums. But it was a kind of wonderful return to that first place that I thought I would really like to fix one day. And so this is going back to the 1935 map, which is the sort of 19th century plan. And you can see there was a church here that must have been torn down in the 1970s. And this piece of the site, although the master plan is both chunks here, the part that I was addressing as part of the team was this northern part. Well, really it was, we as a team decided to restore the gap between the buildings so that it would create this access onto St. Augustine's Church. And here you can see three, again, variations on the mansion block, but these ones are bigger, deeper, more capacity. Every project we do gets denser as time goes by because of the housing demand in London. And so you can see they also draw on the language of the previous project, Albert Corder, Bronte and Fielding, because I felt that there's a kind of consistency that's needed in South Kilburn. It's not really about doing something different every time, that subtle variations sort of in the manner of the Georgian terraced house, or even the Victorian mansion block. They're all variations on the theme. So this is a slightly more complex plan arrangement. There are three cores with flats off of each core at the ground level, and as you go up the building, and then this little Flatiron building in the corner is really like this because there's a huge water main that goes right under the site. So we couldn't build above the water main. So this combination of site geometry allowed us to create as much space as possible and really maximize the capacity of the buildings by flaring the ends. And so this is what's called Unity Place now. So Brent Council has taken full ownership of this whole project, and it's 100% social rent, and every resident in these 3 buildings was homeless or living in temporary accommodation for, you know, over the last 5 years. So it's really amazing to be able to provide this quality of home for people who really had no home or were living in bedsits for the last 5 years. And so the same kind of language of verandas, and to create that sense of a front door, the access to the church, it connects to the wider neighborhood. Our material shared across the team was the light brick that comes from the South Kilburn conservation area, or inspired by the conservation area. And here I'm sort of rotating the camera so you can see how the 3 buildings frame, you know, allow views into the communal garden. And then the little Flatiron building is really in dialogue with the sort of pub building across the street. And this again sort of frames the street and creates a kind of focusing of views towards the northern part of the site, where my very first project is in South Kilburn. And this is the internal sort of leading into the communal garden. So we used glazed brick here, again in the sort of Victorian tradition of using glazed brick to bring light and reflectivity to internal courtyard spaces. And this is a view out from one of the new residents' homes on the ground floor. So the final project I'm going to talk about, because I know we don't have much time, is what Bob mentioned earlier, which is our project in King's Cross. Now this is, in a way, again, I think of it as an archetype. It's modifying in a way, the quadrangle as an urban archetype, and the tower as an urban archetype. And it's really was conceived as a threshold to one part of the master plan, which is actually Bob's master plan, which he should really be talking about. But King's Cross, as you probably all know, was this major transport and distribution hub in the centre of London, with St. Pancras Station on the left, George Gilbert Scott, one of my favorite Victorian architects, neo-Gothic exuberance, and then King's Cross Station on the right. And you can see the whole area sort of extends northward, and you can see in this master plan CGI, which is now pretty much built, not quite finished yet, the complete transformation of this neighborhood. And I do use it as an example whenever I give talks around the world as an example of a kind of amazing achievement of bringing grain and integrating historic elements into new public realm, and a whole series of many buildings by very good architects, and an overall kind of just a wonderful atmosphere. It's like a destination for me in particular. One of the few places in London where you can just be here in Granary Square, away from cars, and just have some space and some kind of sense of the sky and these things that we miss. So I competed for this site here at the top of Lewis Cubitt Park. And again, here's the Bob's master plan that shows the Coal Drops Yard and Granary Square at one end, Lewis cubic part, which forms an axis, and then this site meeting York Way, which you can see has to negotiate a quite unusual geometry. I'm always working in pointed or triangular or prow sites for some reason, but the geometry was an interesting quality of the site, and the fact that here on the left you can see it's a threshold from York Way into the master plan, as well as a kind of point or marker building at the top of Lewis Cubic Park. So as I said earlier, just really for me the ambition was to bring some of the character of King's Cross, such as its wonderful, you know, really athletic arch building of the late 19th century, and also St. Pancras Station and its beautiful brickwork, and another language of arches, many different arch types, and to sort of reinterpret that and draw it up to the top of the master plan to create that identity and that place and to build on it. So these are early sort of competition process models, an early sketch I did that really just sort of went for it in terms of a language of arches. And this was really working within the master plan parameters. So on the left, you can see the sort of planning envelope, the Victoria line, I think, goes under the building. And so we couldn't build very high on this part of the site. And then it was a process of kind of carving and extracting mass to arrive at a kind of sculpted form that creates a silhouette and creates a kind of urban tableau. And that's expressed in this drawing that shows how when you sort of unfold the elevations, you get a sort of skyline that's animated. And you can see also the language of arches that we developed to express this idea of threshold and to invite everybody up to the top end of the master plan and through the site from York Way. And these are our competition sort of concept renders from the competition stage that show this ambition. And the arches are irregular. They follow the structural grid, but they vary in height, and it creates this kind of lyrical quality that helps create a kind of dynamism, which is another thing I try to achieve in our housing projects in their kind of language and fenestration. So here you can see that it's a perimeter block. It's a kind of quadrangle with a reflecting pool at the center and a colonnade, 2 vertical cores, and then commercial and mixed use spaces around the perimeter. And on the right, you can see the kind of stacking of program, flats. There's even a little house here at the top of this piece of the project. Here's Carrie from my team. We were celebrating winning the competition, I think. We held this up, and it's right in the spot where the building is actually being built right now. And again, this is just the plan showing how it's working very hard to address every corner of the site, to provide the kind of mixed use spaces. And then the kind of workhorse, which is the housing above, that's very, you know, all reasonably generous space standards, but very efficient in terms of its layout. Here are some early study models. We spent many weeks and months working out how we would express the arches in the beautiful red brick of St. Pancras Station. And then we finally arrived at this kind of Bezier splayed voussoirs, which had to be scripted to get them to, we have, I think, 12 different types of arch, and they're hard to draw. And so we've done the whole thing in Revit, and all of our Revit files and scripts have gone straight to the manufacturer, and the building is being prefabricated fully and is up at the 2nd story already. So here are the final renders. This is this very important sense of threshold, permeability, and welcome at the ground floor. They're double height ground floor, so they can take on any use in the future, we hope. Here we've played with the vaults, the language of vaults and mirrors to create the sense of an infinite colonnade. And that's looking back towards the park. Then moving into the internal courtyard, this in a way evokes a kind of Roman courtyard, or we're working with Todd Longstaff Gowan, who basically developed this idea of a reflecting pond and the fundamenta, like the canals of Venice. We have high ambitions for this project. And principles like this, you know, it's a thin building, so you get this double transparency. You can see through the building to the park. And as you move around it to the west, you can see the form kind of transforms, and it drops down to, because we're spanning the railway line here, so it becomes a one-story element. And what I really like about that is it starts to look like the viaducts that come north from St. Pancras Station. So it starts to really feel like a building that emerges from a kind of railway infrastructure. And then we again have fought very hard for high ceilings and French doors. And as a counterpoint, this kind of hopefully tranquil and quiet oasis at the center of the building. So this is really my one of my last slides. We, at the current Biennale in Venice, we brought together a number of our housing projects, including King's Cross, which you can see here on the left, top left, Cadence. Our mansion blocks are in here, and really our installation talks about how housing as a form of infrastructure, social infrastructure, can operate in all these other ways to create spaces for production, for manufacturing, for community projects, as well as commercial and co-working space, and that we have to really think of housing as being more than that. It's a place of creativity, production, and wider, all the wider elements that create our sense of well-being. So I hope that gives you an overview of my current work and my thinking in this locality, and I'd be happy to take questions or have a conversation with you, Bob. Thank you.
Brilliant. Alison, you know, thanks so much for that. That was really a wonderful talk, and really beautiful buildings, I must say, that you've been showing to us. And it hadn't dawned on me actually what a wonderfully satisfying thing you've been able to do in Kilburn, you know, in an area that you know so well, and have that opportunity to transform it really and recover some of those earlier qualities. Really, you know, very interesting indeed. Now I'd like to see if I can open up for questions, and I can't see all the. How do I make sure I see everybody?
Now people might need to take some time to type their questions, so we might need to wait a bit.
Okay. Well, maybe shall I start off? I could maybe start off with a question while they start to appear. There were a couple of things really I wanted to ask, Alison, and they are, I must admit, they're things which are maybe particularly things that as another practitioner, you know, I worry about and think about. And there were two